On shortwave and medium wave, Digital Radio Mondiale offers great reception. Experience DRM.
The BBC and Digital Radio Mondiale. Better radio altogether.
BBC World Service. It's 5 hours GMT. Welcome to Weekend with Paul Henley. Coming up, we'll be hearing about the latest allegations of Russian collusion with President Trump's son-in-law, Jared Kushner. We'll be hearing about the Korgos Gateway, a hub on what's been dubbed the New Silk Road.
This is where the East meets the West. This is a place where the trains from China connect with the trains that go straight to Europe. So if I touch my hands on both sides, this is the center of the Silk Road.
And our North America editor, following President Trump on his first foreign trip, says that those expecting the US president to trip up have been proved wrong.
The more important thing to note is that he walked tall and didn't fall over. The low bar that the naysayers had set, he jumped over easily.
That's all to come on Weekend after the world news.
I'm Debbie Russ with the BBC News. Hello. US media have made fresh claims about purported links between President Trump's transition team and the Russian government, the subject of a current FBI investigation. Nick Bryant has the details.
The Washington Post reports that at a meeting in Trump Tower last December, Jared Kushner proposed to the Russian ambassador, Sergei Kislyak, that they set up a secret and secure channel of communications between the Trump transition team and the Kremlin, and also the possibility of using Russian diplomatic facilities, an embassy or consulate, so as to avoid eavesdropping by US intelligence. Also at the meeting was the former National Security Advisor Michael Flynn, who was forced to resign less than a month into his job after misleading White House officials about his contacts with the ambassador. The New York Times is reporting that the purpose of this secret communications channel was to enable Mr. Flynn to discuss Syria and other security issues with a senior military official in Moscow, although the channel was never set up.
The United Nations Secretary-General Antonio Guterres has called on President Donald Trump to stay engaged with the Paris Climate Change Agreement. Leaders of the G7 group of industrial nations meeting in Sicily have been trying to persuade Mr. Trump not to withdraw the US from the 2015 deal. Mr. Guterres told the BBC the accord would survive regardless.
We think it's very important that the American government stays engaged, but this is not the end of the world. I mean, independently of the position that one government might have, independently of what the country involved, and of course the US is very important because of its dimension, all the others should stay the course.
The Egyptian militaries carried out airstrikes in neighbouring Libya, targeting jihadist training camps. The authorities said the raids at sites near the eastern Libyan city of Derna were in retaliation for an attack in central Egypt on Friday. 28 people were killed when masked gunmen opened fire on a bus carrying a group of Coptic Christians. Libyan militia groups opposed to the UN-backed government have launched a series of attacks to try to regain territory in the Libyan capital, Tripoli. Witnesses said residential areas had been shelled. Rana Jawad reports.
These types of clashes are characteristic of the factional divisions and lawlessness in Libya. Tripoli's Ministry of Health says dozens were killed and injured. It's not clear how many civilians have been affected, but most of the dead so far are reportedly fighters. This latest battle is between militias led by the head of the rival, now former self-proclaimed government, and forces nominally allied to the UN-backed government. The internationally recognized authorities condemned the fighting, saying there was no room left for anarchy and chaos.
World News from the BBC. The US military says it will, for the first time, test whether it can shoot down an intercontinental ballistic missile. Officials at the Pentagon said that the experiment, planned to take place next Tuesday, was not in reaction to any specific event. However, concerns have recently been raised in Washington about advances in North Korea's own missile program. More details from David Willis.
If this test is successful, it's possible that it could potentially help thwart an attack from a rogue state such as North Korea. Not, I might add, a full-scale onslaught of missiles from a country such as Russia or China, which could fire dozens of these sort of missiles at a time. But you're right, the Pentagon has been considering its options in regards to North Korea for several weeks now, in case President Trump decides on military action. It's also been looking at pursuing diplomatic and economic options as well.
The death has been announced in the United States of Zbigniew Brzezinski, the national security advisor to President Carter and briefly an advisor to the Obama campaign. He was 89. His tenure was marked by Iran's seizure of the U.S. embassy in Tehran. He played a key part in the White House team which tried to secure the release of the U.S. embassy staff held hostage. Mr. Brzezinski, who was born in Poland, was regarded as a hawkish foreign policy expert. Chile's President Michelle Bachelet has attended a ceremony marking the start of construction for $1 billion astronomical observatory high in the Atacama Desert. The extremely large telescope, set to begin operating in 2024, will be 5 times bigger than the largest current observatories. Ms. Bachelet said the building would represent the possibilities of science. Astronomers said it had the potential to transform our understanding of the universe. BBC News.
Hello, with the time at 5:06 GMT. Welcome to Weekend from the BBC World Service. I'm Paul Henley. First up, there have been further revelations in the United States about the alleged involvement of President Trump's son-in-law, Jared Kushner, in secret dealings with Russia. Nick Bryant, who's our correspondent in Washington, explains what they're all about. And we hope to come back to that because we can't bring you that tape at the moment. Let's move to a related topic, and Donald Trump boarding Air Force One later today to fly back to the US at the end of his first trip abroad as American president. It was a daunting schedule, taking in Saudi, Israel, Rome, Brussels and Sicily. So how did he get on? Our North America editor, John Sopel, was with him every step of the way. And I'm afraid we can't bring you that due to technical problems. You're listening to the BBC World Service. I'm Paul Henley with Weekend. Let's go back to John Sopel's report now on President Trump's first foreign tour.
Just before Donald Trump left Washington to come on this gruelling trip, the word was that he'd have given anything to get out of it, or anything to shorten it. One, he likes his home comforts. Not that Air Force One is exactly slumming it. And two, he knew that foreign trip with aplomb. Yes, there have been odd little moments that have caused eyebrows to arch and social media to fizz. Melania batting his hand away when he tried to hold it. There was the moment that Bibi Netanyahu introduced them in Israel as the President Donald Trump and the first wife. Well, close. He could have either said the President and third wife or the President and First Lady. And then there was the press release put out by the White House with a spelling mistake which read, "The purpose of Donald Trump's Israel trip is to lay the groundwork for a lasting peach." But this is all froth. The more important thing to note is that he walked tall and didn't fall over. The low bar that the naysayers had set, he jumped over easily. In Saudi, he delivered a well-thought-out, bold and optimistic speech on how the fight against extremism and religious intolerance could be won. Yes, you might disagree with the policy of siding so closely with Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states, but he made a lot of friends and generated a great deal of excitement about the possibilities ahead. In Israel, there were no missteps either. But let's just raise the bar a little higher. He'd spoken before leaving Washington that peace between Israelis and Palestinians wouldn't be that difficult. But did the President move the peace process on during the visit? Well, in his speech at the Israel Museum, there was nothing about next steps, talks, confidence-building measures. On that score, it's hard to see what's changed. Did he win the Pope over? Didn't much feel like it. And are all NATO members about to cough up loads more money? Well, let's see. But one other striking thing about this trip. The President and his team stayed as far away from us as was humanly possible. When I travelled with President Obama, there'd be quite a lot of social interaction at each location, cocktail parties where you'd have the chance to talk to some of the key policymakers. It may not have given you a news story, but you got context. There's been no interaction this time round. And there's one other thing. He's barely tweeted. We started wondering whether he didn't have data roaming on his mobile phone package. The only tweets have been to say how much he's enjoyed meeting this one or that one. And the net effect, he hasn't fueled any of the fires burning about Russia and the AI and that's left the army of US correspondents travelling with him with nothing to do but report on the trip. The Pope, Saudi, the visit to the Western Wall. Exactly what the White House would have wanted. The focus has been on his agenda. The takeout, as Americans are fond of saying, well, maybe tweet a good deal, a lot more. And just imagine how
about the alleged involvement of President Trump's son-in-law, Jared Kushner, in secret dealings with Russia. Here's Nick Bryant to explain that.
There's an amazing sort of tag team effect at the moment between the Washington Post and the New York Times, the two major newspapers in America, who are just coming out with exclusive after exclusive about the FBI investigation into Russian meddling in last year's presidential election and the possibility of collusion between the campaign of Donald Trump and the Kremlin. Now, first out of the traps on Friday night was the Washington Post. They're reporting at a meeting in Trump Tower last December between Jared Kushner and the Russian ambassador Sergei Kislyak, in which Kushner, and remember he's the president's son-in-law, proposed that they set up a secret and secure channel of communications between the Trump transition team and the Kremlin, and also the possibility of using Russian diplomatic facilities. And that's what makes this particularly extraordinary. An embassy or a consulate, Russian gear, so as to avoid eavesdropping, not by foreign governments, but by the American government and the US intelligence community. And Paul, also at that meeting, was the former National Security Advisor Michael Flynn, who was forced to resign, you remember, less than a month into his job after misleading White House officials about his contacts with the ambassador. So, you know, an extraordinary story breaking on a Friday night. And then the New York Times came up with more reporting later that suggested that the purpose of these secret communications channels was to enable Mr. Flynn to discuss Syria and other security issues with a senior military official in Moscow.
So the implication of these stories is that the Trump team basically trusted the Russians more than they trusted their own, or rather America's own, intelligence services.
Yeah, I mean, Donald Trump has continually railed against US intelligence. He hates these leaks coming out of the intelligence community. He was critical of them during the presidential transition. It's almost like he declared war on his own intelligence community. But this is still extraordinary that they should actually approach the Russians in this way and make this proposal to use their facilities and their gear to protect those conversations from being heard by the Obama administration and the CIA and groups like that. It's absolutely amazing. I mean, the channel was never set up, and the New York Times is actually reporting that the idea was dropped when it was announced that Rex Tillerson would become Donald Trump's Secretary of State. Now, Rex Tillerson has contacts of his own with Moscow. He sort of had a good relationship with Vladimir Putin because of his former role as the head of ExxonMobil. And so it's quite extraordinary that the Trump team seemed to trust the Russians during the transition more than they trusted their own side.
So the allegations are extraordinary, but to what extent would they be illegal?
Well, as I say, the channel was never set up. So, and discussing something like that in itself wouldn't be illegal necessarily. Nobody's suggesting any illegality at this point. But, you know, it does raise even more concerns and questions about the nature of the relationship between the Trump transition team and the Kremlin. And it comes on a night when Reuters, the news agency, again weighed in with an exclusive of its own, and that Jared Kushner had at least 3 previously undisclosed contacts with the Russian ambassador not only after the presidential election, during this phase that we call the transition between the election and inauguration, which is a couple of months, but also during the presidential election. 2 phone calls between April and November last year, according to a couple of sources who have told Reuters this. So again, it creates just more context between the Trump team and the Kremlin. And it's worth pointing out that Jared Kushner hasn't disclosed those calls before, and in his security clearance application, he didn't disclose that meeting with the Russian ambassador at Trump Tower. It was only later that the White House actually confirmed that. Now, Jared Kushner's lawyer has been speaking. He said Mr. Kushner participated in thousands of calls in this time period. That was last year. He's no recollection of the calls as described. He's asked Reuters for the dates of such alleged calls, so we may look into it. He's saying that Reuters hasn't given him that information at the moment. But this is hugely troubling. I mean, Donald Trump went away on this foreign trip hoping to escape from this swirl of controversy over these possible Russian links, and he'll return in the early hours of Sunday morning to arguably an even bigger storm than he left.
That was our correspondent in Washington, Nick Bryant. You're listening to the BBC World Service. I'm Paul Henley with Weekend. Now let's go live to Manchester now in the north of England, almost a week since the suicide bombing which killed 22 people, many of them children. The bomber, Salman Abedi, was born in Manchester. He was of Libyan descent and is thought to have returned from Libya just 4 weeks before the police investigating what they think is a network that might have helped him. Katrina Renton joins us now live from Manchester. Welcome, Katrina. The police are making it clear that their investigation is yielding real results, aren't they?
Well, that's right. They've all said now that they've managed, they think, to catch a large part of this network that led to the attack in Manchester on Monday evening. 11 men are now in custody, aged between 18 and 44 years old. They're being held on suspicion of terror offences. Of course, nobody has been charged, and this number has gone up, obviously, overnight. Yesterday evening, a 44-year-old man was arrested, and overnight 2 more men aged 20 and 22 were also held. So 11 is the total of people in custody now. There have been 13 in the course of this investigation, but a 16-year-old boy and a 34-year-old woman were both released without charge. Now, this is a big day in Manchester today. There are big events going on. The Great City Games got underway yesterday. They started with a minute's silence, and people here standing together defiant. Of course, they are still in mourning, still coming to terms with what happened here on Monday night following the Ariana Grande concert at the Manchester Arena. But again, still trying to get on with things as normal, and that's another large part of the police operation following that event, to make sure that the events this weekend can go on as planned. The Great Manchester Run scheduled for Sunday. 35,000 runners are registered for that. There's a big pop concert at Old Trafford also scheduled for tonight. Now, I've been in the square here in central Manchester for about an hour now, and I have already seen a very heavy armed police presence as people start to get about their business this morning. And that is deliberate, of course. That is to make sure that people feel safe and reassured. The police want people, they've said, go out and enjoy yourselves as planned this weekend. They don't want this bank holiday weekend to be hampered by what has happened, the horrific tragedy on Monday night. And very much the message on the tributes in the square here is that people say they will stand together. People coming out to support these events, their unity, to show their support for the people of Manchester. And of course, the pop singer whose event this happened afterwards, Ariana Grande, she has been tweeting that she will have a tribute concert for the victims in honour of the victims, and she says that she and her fans, we will continue in honour of the ones we lost. So people here in Manchester standing very much together as they try and move on following the events on Monday night.
Many thanks. Katrina Renton live from Manchester. A gun attack on a bus carrying Coptic Christians in Egypt has left at least 28 people dead, many of them children. We'll be talking to Bishop Angelos, who's a UK-based Coptic Christian, later in the programme, but late last night he gave us this reaction.
Well, it is tragic today with families that have left their homes with all the intention of spending a day and going to a religious site and spending a day of prayer and visitation, and then being caught in the middle of such a bloody attack. We know that there were children on this bus. There were elderly people there as well, and it's not very unlike what happened here in Manchester, where the most vulnerable have been targeted. I spoke to our bishop in Minya, and I knew from him at the time there were 26 confirmed who lost their life. It's now 28, and we're expecting the death toll to actually rise because some are very seriously injured.
Do you know how the attack happened?
Yes, from what we've heard, it was a gun attack from a number of assailants who shot at the bus from the outside and then proceeded to board and shoot innocent people as they sat.
That was Coptic Christian Bishop Angelos here in the UK. This is the BBC World Service. The time is 5:20 GMT, and it's time for the sports news. Here's Andy Barwell. Hi.
Hello. Well, Chelsea have been in irresistible form this season. They'll look to try and make it a league and cup double in England when the Premier League champions take on Arsenal in today's FA Cup final at Wembley Stadium. With his thoughts on the big game, here's John Murray.
It's been a vintage season for the FA Cup, with giant killers such as Lincoln City and Sutton United making their mark before the heavyweights came to the fore. And so with the weather set fair, we have a final featuring the competition's two most successful clubs of the 21st century. Chelsea will begin it 90 minutes away from completing the second League and FA Cup double in their history. If Arsenal triumph, they'll have won it for a record 13th time. And Arsene Wenger would have seen his teams win the famous old trophy 7 times. Manager has ever done before.
Well, one British newspaper this morning reports that Arsene Wenger will get a new 2-year deal with Arsenal, whatever the result of today's big match. With the club missing out on Champions League football for the first time in 2 decades, some Arsenal fans think that it's time to go. Well, the man in the opposing technical area today, the Chelsea boss, Antonio Conte, says that Wenger is a legend.
I think he deserves to work with Arsenal because he showed in these 20 years to be a great manager. He did a good job, and only in this, the Champions League. And the Champions League is a good target, and Arsenal played for 19 years in a row this competition. I think this shows that his work was very good.
Well, Barcelona bid to salvage some silverware from what's been a disappointing season by winning the Kings Cup final in Spain. They take on Alaves in what is coach Luis Enrique's final game in charge. After losing the last 3 finals, Borussia Dortmund take on Eintracht Frankfurt in the German Cup. And Paris Saint-Germain face Angers, aiming to win the French Cup for a 3rd season in a row. And Celtic bid for the domestic treble when they take on Aberdeen in the Scottish Cup, after claiming a 6 of the League Athletics meeting at Eugene in Oregon. Despite perfect weather conditions and having pace setters for the race, there was no 5,000 metres world record for the Ethiopian Ganzebe Dibaba. Her time was 14 seconds off that best. The Monaco Grand Prix and the Indianapolis 500 are 2 of motorsport's oldest and most prestigious races. Both are staged this weekend. The 2-time Formula One world champion Fernando Alonso is swapping the glamour of Monaco for the most famous oval racetrack in the world. And Nick de Groot from motorsport.com can explain that Alonso's presence in the United States is a good thing for the sport.
Oh, what he's done for IndyCar is just... it's exponential. With him here, I have never seen so much buzz. I mean, we've had Kurt Busch here, a NASCAR champion, because the American crowd theoretically should be more excited about the Fernando Alonso, but they are really thrilled to have him here. His presence here has done nothing but good things for IndyCar and Indianapolis Motor Speedway.
And in cycling, the Colombian Nairo Quintana has a 38-second advantage going into today's penultimate stage on the Giro d'Italia, which today features 2 big climbs.
If you think of a place where the east meets the west, a remote area on the will probably not feature in your mind. A $250 million railway hub has emerged from sand dunes there in just a few years, and the people behind it believe it will connect Europe with Asia, reviving the ancient Silk Road. Paulina Romanova reports.
This is Korgos Gateway in the east of Kazakhstan. It's a dry port, a rail terminal built more than 2,000 kilometers from the nearest seaport, pretty much in the middle of nowhere.
I can imagine how my face looked the first time I came to here, because when I came to here 3 years ago, I saw slopes and hills of sand, and that was it.
Carl Gayson was asked to be the first CEO of the Gateway, right from the start.
There was no street, there was no rail, no train, no electricity, no office, no nothing. And they said, Karel, this is your new place. And I went like, okay. And then, we need some trains quite fast. And I went, okay.
A train arrives from China carrying cargo to Europe. The reason it has to stop here and why Korgos is so important is the rail tracks. The Chinese ones are slightly narrower than the Kazakh ones. To continue the journey, the containers must be moved from one set of tracks to the other by 3 tall cranes.
This is where the east meets the west. This is a place where the trains from China connect with the trains that go straight to Europe. So if I touch my hands on both sides, this is the center of the Silk Road. Europe should care about what we are doing right here, because it is bringing China closer to Europe. It is bringing Europe closer to China.
So I've got my high-vis, I've got my hard hat. Now I'm gonna climb one of these huge yellow contraptions to find what it takes to be a crane operator. I climb in full cab, 16 meters off the ground.
In summer it's hot. The sun bakes you. The cabin heats up. It's all metal everywhere. So it's like working under magnifying glass. It's like being in a microwave up here.
It's stuffy and cramped, but this is where crane operator Galina works for 12 hours a day.
The hardest thing is to carry out my work safely, without breaking the rules, without any deviations, so that there are no accidents, no collisions. Women who work on the cranes are probably more precise about what they do, more attentive, more serious in their attitude to work.
You don't have to wander far from the Korgos Gateway to see what life used to be like around here. Medet, a sheep farmer, lives in the shadow of the dry port. Nothing has really changed for him, but he has high hopes for his children.
Before they built the dry port, there were no proper roads, just grasslands and sand dunes all around. We've been herding sheep and cows, but now it's all changed. Trains appeared, new houses are being built, there's a new highway with cars. I want my children to work here, on the railway port. I don't want them working in a field like me.
The Gateway sits within a special economic zone with a free trade center and managed with China. Kazakhstan also wants to build huge logistics and industrial hubs around the dry port, creating tens of thousands of new jobs. The area, though, is currently a desert. I meet one of the few visitors to the dry port, Wade Shepard, a journalist writing a book on what he calls the New Silk Road.
One of the major challenges that Korgos Gateway has, and of Kazakhstan in general, is kind of evolving beyond this post-Soviet, highly bureaucratic, top-down, relationship-heavy post-Soviet mentality, and kind of evolving into something that's commercially viable on an international level. And that's a transition that's both political, economic, and social. And for Korgos Gateway to truly be successful, they need to make this transition.
Back at the Gateway, they're loading the last containers onto a train that's heading for Europe. Now it's off, traveling 7,000 kilometers, Kazakhstan, Russia, Belarus, then Poland, before finally arriving in Germany in a fortnight's time.
For now, the dry port handles just 3 or 4 trains a day. But Kalgason is confident it won't be long before placing with trade.
Over on the Kazakhstan-China border. You're tuned to Weekend from the BBC World Service, live from London.